So welcome to our first session of a three-session class on Introduction to Kabbalah. I'm Rabbi Michael Lottger, and what we're about to do is a mitzvah. It is a mitzvah to immerse yourselves in sacred matters. So because it's a mitzvah, we have a special mitzvah blessing that we say. Actually, in the third session, we're going to devote some time to learning the different blessings because they have highly significant Kabbalistic significance. So the blessing, thanks God for giving us commandments and commanding us to occupy ourselves with words of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And I will begin screen share. And okay, so I'll ask my standard Ask E on the Cheryl. Does it look good? Okay, thank you. Okay, so the overview of the class. 3 sessions are not enough. 3 months are not enough. 3 years are not enough. And if you believe in the Kabbalistic teaching of Gilgulei Nefashot, which is reincarnation, 3 lifetimes are not enough to devote yourself and immerse yourself in Kabbalah. But this is what we have. Tonight, the focus is going to be on an introduction to Kabbalah, to the texts, and some words about its history of Kabbalah. The second session is going to deal with the central text of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar, and the 10 Sefirot, which is dealing intensely with the nature of God. Just going to look at chat for a second. Here, yeah, okay, got it. And then the third session is going to be on Lurrianic Kabbalah, Kabbalistic understanding of how the universe was created, ideas about the soul, angels, and what we can do practically to enhance our Jewish spirituality. And I always begin with a word from my sponsor. I am brought to you courtesy of the Jewish Federation of Ventura County, where I am a community rabbi, and Joel and Barbara Aronson and their Affordable Living Choices Trust allows me to skip the step of having you all register in much more detail and sending in money. So as always, and I know some of you are attending one of my classes for the first time, I keep a lot of material on my website. My website is just simply lottger.com. And if you click or type in lottger.com, you will see this welcome page. And if you look up here, it says classes. If you click on there, you will see a description of this class and a copy of the slides, some suggested reading, a learner's guide to blessings. We're going to touch on that in the third session. And then the video of session 1. The video of session 1 is not up yet. So if you click there and expect to see the video of what's actually happening tonight, we have to have a discussion about time travel, but that's a different story. So before we begin Kabbalah, the discussion of Kabbalah, it's important to touch upon some basics of Judaism. One of the major differences, and I know we have some non-Jews in our group as well as Jewish friends, one of the major differences between Judaism and many other religions, but certainly a difference between Judaism and Christianity, is that the focus of Judaism is not so much on what you're supposed to believe, but what you're supposed to do. In Christianity, there's a focus on what you're supposed to believe. And because there is a wide range of beliefs, there are a wide range of Christian denominations. There are 43,000 different Christian denominations. We certainly don't have that range in the Jewish world. What you're supposed to do are commandments. The Hebrew word mitzvah means commandment, and Jews count 613 commandments simply in the Torah alone, the first 5 books of the Bible. And by the way, I do want to encourage you, if I use a Hebrew word or a Yiddish word and you don't understand it, don't be shy about typing a question in the chat. So lots of commandments. Certainly most people are familiar at least with the idea of the 10 commandments, but there are others that are very significant such as love your neighbor as yourself, love the stranger. In fact, the most often repeated commandment in the Hebrew Bible deals with protecting the defenseless in society. That commandment appears 36 separate times. There are commandments about what you're supposed to eat and what you're not supposed to eat, like not eating pork. There are ethical, certainly business-related commandments like paying wages promptly, and so on. Lots and lots of commandments. And then, as we'll see, the rabbis add thousands more. So Judaism is a religion of orthopraxis, of what you're supposed to do, rather than orthodoxy, what you're supposed to believe. And there are many, many Jews who would hold that almost everything we're going to talk about with regard to Kabbalah is nonsense. In fact, in the conservative movement and the Reform movement have a history of being very analytical and scientific and not so Kabbalistic. The head of the Jewish Theological Seminary once said that Kabbalah is Narishkeit. Narishkeit is a Yiddish word which means nonsense. But the study of Kabbalah is scholarship. So there was a great respect for the study, the scientific study of Kabbalah, but particularly in the last 100 years, I would say the conservative movement and the Orthodox, the conservative movement and the Reform movement have moved away from Kabbalistic practices. I think that is changing now. And also the focus of Judaism is on this world rather than the next world. Judaism teaches that there is a world beyond this one, and I think I even have a slide on that and how you can gain more information on that. Yeah, in a minute I will show you. So again, by way of introduction, this stuff is not easy. It was never intended to be easy or simply understandable. It was traditionally studied only by married adult men who had family responsibilities. And the fear was that some of the temptations in Kabbalah of meditation, of separating yourself, of contemplation of God, would be so attractive that it might lead one into sort of a world of going off and being almost like a monk. And the understanding is that if you're married and you have children, you can't do that. You have responsibilities to your wife, to your children, to your world. So Kabbalah was traditionally only studied by men. I'll say more about that. And people who are well-grounded by those of high moral standards, prior rabbinic learning, and mental and emotional stability. And traditionally, Kabbalah was studied one-on-one, one student with one teacher. And the reason is it is so easy to misunderstand what is going to be said. And in one way, I'm delighted that there's a recording. So, you know, if you'd like, you can always go back to the recording and hear something a second or a third time, because it is very easy to misunderstand. The goal of this class is to provide an introduction and orientation, and maybe to whet your appetite. Disclaimers. I am a student of Kabbalah. I think the last time I counted about 130 books on Kabbalah, and I'm in the midst of the 131st. I'm very interested in it, but I am not a Kabbalist. I am not a practitioner of Kabbalah. I will be sharing with you my struggle to learn this, and I'll also be sharing with you the reason I'm not a practitioner, because there are certain things in the world of Kabbalah I find very difficult to accept, and I will be, certainly willing and happy to share those with you. There is value, I'll speak autobiographically. There is value to hearing things over and over again. With many of these concepts, I find I've only been able to begin to get it after I've heard it about 10 times, that I can actually incorporate it into sort of RAM, for those of you that are computer type folks. And then I can, I can begin to really understand it enough to teach it. So for some of you, this may be the 10th time. For some of you, it may be the first time. There could well be those of you out there that know this material far better than I, and I hope you'll feel free to chime in with other ideas and other concepts. Kabbalah and Judaism are connected. I just found this quote today from Byron Sherwin. Without Judaism, Jewish mysticism is a soul without a body, a vagabond spirit. Without mysticism, Judaism is a body without a soul. That gives you a sense, at least from his perspective, of the connectedness of the two. And later on in the same book, he says, detaching Kabbalistic practice from traditional Judaism would be like performing an operation with instruments that are not sterile. I suspect I will say this again in other parts of this discussion, but Kabbalah is Judaism on steroids. The beginning step of Kabbalah is to be, I would say, an Orthodox practicing Jew. And then Kabbalah begins to take you to deeper and higher levels of practice and connection with God. And I'm going to silence my phone, so it's only God we're connected with. Other phone calls. Okay. So I'm going to start by, I have lots of books, as I said. Here's a particularly good one. I have a collection of recommended books. It'll be on the website. This is a wonderful spirituality handbook. It collects writings from many, many different authors. So here's one from Rifat Sonsino, Definitions of Spirituality. And I'm just going to read the ones I've kind of double highlighted. Spirituality, as I understand it, is noticing the wonder, noticing that what seems disparate and confusing to us is actually whole. Spirituality is a striving for life in the presence of God and the fashioning of a life of holiness appropriate to such striving. Spirituality speaks to the immediacy of God's presence. Spirituality is essentially a way of responding to God, becoming conscious of God. Spirituality is the process through which the individual strives to meet God. So you see, I would say one of the connecting themes here is spirituality is a striving to deepen your connection with God. Kabbalah is not the setting to discuss the question, is there a God or isn't there a God? Kabbalah, the Bible, all these texts assume that there is a God, assume that there's a connection between God and humanity, and Kabbalah now is an exercise with how do I become more intimately connected to God. I once heard Larry Kushner, someone who I will quote a lot here, talk about that the idea that Kabbalah is or spirituality is a sneaking suspicion that everything is really interconnected. One of his books is called Invisible Lines of Connection, which talk about the connectiveness of everything. So I'll go to this slide and then maybe I'll pause and see if there's any questions or comments, and I should take a look at least one more chat. Yeah, let me go through this slide and then I will address Richard's question. So one question is it Kabbalah or Kabbalah? And the answer is both. Kabbalah is the Ashkenazi way of pronouncing Hebrew. Broadly speaking, there are two major ways of pronouncing Hebrew: Ashkenazi or Sephardic. Ashkenazi is the Jews of Eastern Europe. Sephardic are the Jews that come originally out of Spain, and there's also many Jews of Arab lands, and they generally pronounce Hebrew in the Sephardic way. The Sephardic way would be Kabbalah, but it's exactly like the Sabbath. So is the name of the Sabbath Shabbos or Shabbat? Ashkenazi Shabbos, Sephardic Shabbat. Talit or Talis? Talit Sephardic, Talis Ashkenazi. Yisgadal v'Yiskadash Ashkenazi, Yitgadal v'Yitgadash Sephardic. 95%, or at least at one time, it's probably more now, of American Jews are Ashkenazi. So when I went to Hebrew school, and probably many of you also learned pronunciation in Ashkenazi, and then after the 67 war in Israel, I would say the conservative and reform movements in this country decided to go over to the Sephardic way of pronouncing Hebrew, because that's the way Hebrew is spoken in Israel. And so now, if your kids go to Hebrew school or you go to Hebrew school, you will hear the Sephardic way of pronouncing Hebrew. So I'm going to try an experiment. I'm going to stop share so you can see each other and address Richard's question: can you be an adherent of Kabbalah without being Orthodox? It's a free country. I guess you can do what you want, but the essence of Kabbalah is a deeper obedience to God, and at the simple level obedience to God. Heck, we've got 613 commandments in the Torah, thousands more from the rabbis, the Shulchan Aruch, lots and lots of commandments. So that's a place to start. So I would say an authentic adherent of Kabbalah would have an Orthodox lifestyle. That person might go to a Reform synagogue, but would certainly begin with an Orthodox lifestyle. Now, you can be interested in Kabbalah. You can adopt Kabbalistic practices, without being Orthodox. But that's my sense of it. Anybody else have a question or a comment at this point? Just take a second. Okay, so then I will go back to share screen and move on. Hang on. Okay. There it is. Okay. Cheryl, will be back on okay? I don't know where you are. Okay. Okay. So this is one of the definitions that I like. It works for me to understand a basic essence of Kabbalah. You will see people selling Kabbalah water. Next week, I'm going to show you a little copy of a Zohar, which is unreadable, which is sold on Amazon, which is sold online. You hear stories about Madonna wearing a red string around her wrist. So there is a sort of an idea of what I would call magic. Magic is, if I do a bunch of Kabbalistic things, that's going to be a good thing. So the question is why? And magic suggests that if I follow a list of commandments perfectly, so I pray correctly, I pray in Hebrew or I pray in Aramaic, I use the right ritual objects. I've got mezuzahs on every door in my house. I wear fringes or tzitzit all the time. I put on tefillin, prayer rituals in the morning. I do all that stuff. I keep strictly kosher. I do a list and I obey the ethical commandments. I give to charity and so on and so on and so on. Magic suggests if I follow that list, I can get God to do my will. The mystic uses the same list. The Kabbalist uses the same list. That praying correctly, following commandments, keeping kosher, ritual objects. If I do that list, the result is I can get me to do God's will. So a very similar sounding approach, but clearly a fundamentally different approach. And speaking of magic, I can't resist this. You've heard the word abracadabra. Abracadabra is probably Aramaic. And those of you that may know even some Hebrew, is the word, it probably comes from avra kadabra. The root verb here is bara, which means to create. The aleph says I will, and ka, like, dabra, like I have spoken. So abracadabra, I don't know how it actually entered the world of sort of modern magic, but it probably has an Aramaic origin. Jewish spirituality. The essence of Jewish spirituality is the study and delving into sacred texts. So as you will see in this discussion, in this class, I'll be putting texts up on the screen and digging into them. Some of them will actually be somewhat lengthy. But the essence of Jewish spirituality is the following presumption. The presumption is that the texts are actually from God. You might want to argue with that. This is not the time to argue with it. That's the underlying assumption, is these texts are from God. And as the word of God, they are infinitely deep and filled with layers and layers and layers of meaning. So not only Torah, but Bible and Talmud and Zohar, infinitely rich and infinitely deep. I like to think of it, I can't remember who gave me this image of it being like a love letter from God. So I often said, use this example, that if you were, stranded on the proverbial desert island and you had one long letter from the love of your life, and it, spoke of your relationship and your history and your loves and so on, how often would you reread that letter? You would read it over and over and over again. You would wonder why he or she spelled something oddly, why he or she underlined something. I actually once was speaking exactly about this, and I had a woman tell me that this happened to her. And I said, what are you talking about? You were on a, no, she said, I wasn't on a desert island, but I was in a very deep relationship with a guy, and we broke up, and this was before email, so he actually wrote her a letter. And in the letter, he wrote in handwriting, it wasn't typed, you are very, and then she couldn't determine what the next word was. Was he saying you are very lovely, or are you a very lonely? And it affected the entire context of the letter, and it drove her crazy. Welcome to the study of sacred texts. You will find ambiguities in the text, and if the ambiguities aren't already in the text, we will invent them. We will dig deep enough into the text, so we'll create ambiguities. The assumption is that this text is from God, and we can't get enough out of it, so we'll study it deeper and deeper and deeper. And again, leads to mitzvot, leads to commandments in this world. So I'm going to begin with a text from Sefer HaBahir, 12th century. So this is even before the Zohar, about stumbling. And this is actually from a book. Again, I'll have the list of books at the end. This is a book by Daniel Matt called The Essential Kabbalah. And it's a collection of sacred texts. And the nice thing about this book is it gives you wonderfully helpful footnotes. So, to read the text, whoever delves into mysticism cannot help but stumble. As it is written, the stumbling block is in your hand. You cannot grasp these things unless you stumble over them. So again, he's going to, Dr. Matt is going to help us with this. Mysticism, what he calls mysticism here, the Hebrew is ma'aseh v'reshit. I'm sorry, ma'aseh v'reshit u'ma'aseh merkava. Ma'aseh v'reshit means the works of creation. Ma'aseh merkava mean the works or the stories of the merkava. Any of you actually spend time in Israel, or a lot of time in Israel? I don't know if Gabrielle, have you spent a lot of time in Israel? In Israel, if you say Merkava, you're talking about a modern Israeli tank. But the Merkava was Elijah, Eliyahu's chariot. And so there was a very early connection of mysticism with studying the texts from Elijah relating to the chariot. So the works of creation, works of the chariot, the secret of cosmology, and the secrets of the divine realm based on Ezekiel. These constitute two branches of early Jewish mysticism. The stumbling block is in your hand, a quote from Isaiah. And then, unless you stumble over them, is a quote from the Talmud. So if you're stumbling over this stuff and you have difficulty with it, you're exactly doing what you should be doing. If this stuff doesn't puzzle you at all, and it's the first time you're seeing it, I don't believe you. It's puzzling, and it's supposed to be puzzling. Okay, now I have a bunch of texts. This is, I think this is also from the Spirituality Handbook from Moshe Cordeveros, 16th century. And I'm just going to read a few of the highlighted sections here. I know that depending on what device you're reading this on, you won't be able to read all this, but you can get copies of the slides on my website, as well as reviewing this on the video. What should your intention be as you draw near this wisdom? Pursuing the straight paths, dividing your time between Bible, Talmud, and this wisdom. The focus, and we'll see more of this, the focus of Kabbalah, or a focus of Kabbalah, is unifying God. This may sound puzzling because in the Shema, we say God is unity. And at every service we chant Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. We'll talk more about the Shema in a moment. God is Echad, unity. But then at the end of the service, you may recall, end of every Jewish service, we say Bayom Hahu, on that day, Yehi Adonai Echad, God will be one, Ushemo Echad, and God's name will be one. So wait a minute, is God one or is God not one? And the answer is God is one. And as we'll see, I think next week, God is also 10, and the 10 Sefirot. And there's this concept of God because of the destruction of the temple, because Israel is in exile, God is not well connected. All the elements of God are not well connected. And it is up to Jews in traditional Kabbalah. I'm sorry for those of you who are not Jewish. In traditional Kabbalah, this all depends on Jews. It's up to Jews to unify the universe and unify God. Or in the words here, to unite the Blessed Holy One and Shekhinah by enacting the mitzvot. So every time a Jew does a mitzvah, we'll see more of this, a little bit of the universe is healed, and God's male and female aspects are better connected. And if that puzzles you, well, that's your first stumbling block. We're going to talk a lot more about the sexual nature of Kabbalah and God's genders, and I'll use the plural term. One of the elements here is to learn from someone who has followed paths of integrity as far as possible. The books to which you should cleave in order to improve are the compositions of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, namely the various parts of the Zohar, and then he lists a lot more. The Zohar, as I mentioned, is the central text of Kabbalah, and we'll be studying the Zohar in particular, or elements of it, next week. Let's see, some of the things I've highlighted. Peruse these books two ways. First, go over the language of the text many times, taking note to remember fluently. Do not delve deeply at first. Second, study with great concentration according to your ability. If something in this wisdom seems doubtful to you, wait and keep studying and keep being patient. So I want to begin with the beginning. As we dive into text, the obvious place to begin is the beginning of the Torah. So if you opened up a Torah scroll, this is the way the Torah text would look. There are crowns on certain letters. Those of you familiar with some Hebrew will notice there are no vowels. And it goes this way: Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. V'ha'aretz hayta tohu v'vohu v'choshech al panei tahom v'ruach Elohim merachefet al panei hamayim v'yomer Adonai yihi or v'yihi or. Usually translated as in the beginning, although that's not an accurate translation. As you'll see in a moment, it's impossible to have an accurate translation. In the beginning, God created the universe. Another way of reading this is the universe created God. This is just fun with Kabbalah. The heavens and the earth was tohu vavohu, was empty and void, and ruach, and there was darkness on the face of the deep, and ruach Elohim, the spirit of God, merachefet, hovered over the face of the depths. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. So remember, we're going to ask question after question after question after question. So a question the rabbis will ask is, why does the Torah begin with the letter Bet? Bet is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And in fact, in Midrash, in rabbinic commentaries, there's a whole discussion of the letters arguing in front of God, begging God, please begin the Torah with me. And in that Midrash, the answer, why doesn't it begin with Aleph? Because Aleph begins the word Aveira, which means sin. but bet begins the word beracha, which means blessing. But another reason is the shape of the letter. So as we'll see, even the shapes of the letter hold insight and significance. So as you look at this letter, you realize I can't go that way, I'm blocked. I can't go this way, I'm blocked. I can't go that way, I'm blocked. As I look at this letter, and it's written large in a Torah scroll, if you ever see a Torah scroll on Simchat Torah, they will have it open to this section. The only way I can go is this way. So the teaching is, the only wisdom is this way, is the Torah. You can't ask what happens above the Torah, below the Torah, or before the Torah. It's a meaningless question. It's like a physicist asking what happened before the Big Bang. We can have a discussion of that at some point. I think some of you know I was a physicist before being a rabbi. It's a meaningless question. Another reason is, as I mentioned, the Torah is the second letter, so it stands for the number 2. I think in the third session, we're going to talk a little bit about Gematria, which is the numerical significance of Hebrew letters. And another reason that the mystics give to beginning with the letter Bet is to teach us that there are 2 Torahs. And this is very important for those of you who don't know this concept. Jewish tradition holds that there are 2 Torahs. When Moses was at Sinai, he had 2 revelations from God. One was the 5 books of Moses, first 5 books of the Bible. And the second revelation was an oral tradition with the instructions, never write down this tradition, transmit it orally to your students. And eventually, probably 1400 years as the calendar goes, it gets written down because the leading rabbis of the time are afraid that the Jews are being so dispersed and so harassed in the Holy Land that if we don't write down the books of the Torah, we will lose them. Anita, I don't know if you're exercising your arm or you have a question. If you have a question, you need to unmute yourself. If you're just exercising, smile and keep at it. I'm in favor of exercise. Let's see. Yeah, Richard asked to briefly review the Shekhinah. As we'll see next week, the Shekhinah is one of the 10 Sefirot of the understanding the nature of God, and it's the one with which we have the most connection. In biblical Hebrew, Shekhinah, which is a feminine word, is simply the presence of God. It's used in the Bible to mean presence of God. In Jewish mysticism, because Shekhinah is a feminine word, it is understood to be to represent the feminine aspect of God. And as you can imagine, there is a wonderful world of Jewish mythology relating to God's feminine aspect. And if you look on my website, you will see one of the classes I taught some months ago was on Jewish mythology, and I think I have a whole session on Shekhinah. Okay, I mentioned that you can't simply translate the Bible. So this is, again, another example of looking deeper. The first 2 words of the Bible represent a grammatical problem. The first 3 words of the Bible are Bereshit, bara, Elohim. It's often translated as, in the beginning, God created. But if we wanted to say in the beginning, we would say Barishana, bara, Elohim. Bereshit is half of an expression. It's called the smichut in Hebrew. And according to the rules of Hebrew grammar, it requires that it be followed by a noun. It means in the beginning of, and now we need a noun. But the second word of the Bible is not a noun, it's a verb. So if I tried to translate this literally, I would have to say, in the beginning of, God created the heavens and the earth. So what's going on here? One possibility for the rationalists in the group, one possibility is it's a scribal error. Somewhere along the line, Barishana got changed to Bereshit. The rabbis of the Talmud, the mystics, are never going to accept that. They absolutely hold that the text of the Torah that we have is the text that God dictated to Moses. So then they have to ask, why did God make a grammatical error here? One possibility, which we will reject, is that God wasn't so good at Hebrew grammar. I have great sympathy with this because I'm not so good at Hebrew grammar either. Of course, the reason the rabbis and the mystics will conclude that there is a grammatical error between word 1 and word 2, is that God was trying to teach us something. And Rashi's conclusion, Rashi is an 11th century commentator and summarizer of rabbinic commentary up to the point where he writes. Rashi says, God was teaching us that we can't just translate. We have to dig into the text. And let me see if there's a good place to, So Bryce, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, is it possible, and this is just an interpretation that occurred to me, that because the universe did not exist yet, then God could not say in the beginning of something because that something didn't exist? And
but actually, remember in the text it says the earth was there; it was just void and empty, and there was darkness on the face of the deep. So there was some deep, whatever that means, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face. So I think that's a plausible interpretation, but then it would say just in the beginning. So the issue is, why is there a grammatical error? And I like to think of it as God is making a blatant grammatical error for those of us who are a little ADD and might miss it if it came a little bit later. It's between word 1 and word 2 of the text. But certainly, your idea is absolutely plausible. Another bit of text which is very important is V'yomer Elohim na'aseh adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu. And I'm surprised I don't have this. I think there it is, Genesis 1:26. And God says, "Let us make humanity in our image, after our likeness." God here is speaking in the first person plural. God often speaks in the first person singular. The opening of the 10 Commandments. I am the Lord thy God who led you out of Egypt to be your God. It's only in these Genesis stories that God speaks in you might call it the royal we. And the indication in Hebrew, for those of you that know Hebrew, this nun, na'aseh, tells us, let us make. And the nu anian of tzalmenu and kidmutenu, the nu means our also. You hear this, avinu malkenu, our father, our king. The nu is an indication of our. So the other interesting thing about this is cell can mean shadow as well as image. And I think this is a very important point in Kabbalah that I'm going to get to, I think, in 2 weeks. And if we were a smaller group, maybe I'll try this. If we're created in God's image, what does that tell us about God? And what does that tell us about us? I'll come back to that. And again, first person plural, the traditional Jewish answer to the reason it's first person plural is God is speaking to the angel. The question is, who is God speaking to? Let us make humanity in our image. The traditional Jewish answer, God is speaking to the angels. The traditional Christian answer is God is speaking to God's triune self. As you know, in Christianity, there's this concept of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Here's the one I like, that God was talking to the animals. That verse is on the 6th day before humanity is created. What was created before the 6th day? All of creation, all the animals, all the plants, and so on. I think this is a biblical proof text for evolution. God says, okay, I'm going to take the genetic material that I've created so far, and we're going to keep working on it into humanity. So does God have an image? I think most of us are used to the idea of thinking of God as purely spiritual and not having a physical image. That idea comes really emphasized only about 1,000 years ago. I'll mention this, and it really is an influence of Islam more than biblical Judaism. The portrayal of God in the Bible is very anthropomorphic. God speaks, even though in some places it says you can't see God and live. People see God. The biblical idiom for God getting angry is that God's nose gets red. God takes us out of Egypt with an outstretched arm. The references to God biblically are very anthropomorphic. The Jewish philosophers, Maimonides and his group, of around 1,000 years ago say that these are figures of speech. They would say, Maimonides says, the Torah has to talk in the language of men, so uses these figures of speech, but that's the philosophers talking. My impression is the Kabbalists go overboard in the opposite direction. Rather than having no image of God, they are going to have dozens of images of God. And there is a early Kabbalistic text, 6th century, called Shiur Koma, where God's physical measurements are listed. Certainly not in miles. They are listed in a, kind of an ancient measure. I actually don't remember. I think the parasangs, but I don't remember. It at least it's clear to Dr. Matt what they are. So God's feet are 100 million miles. Roughly the distance from here to the sun, from the ankle to his knees, 665 million miles. Neck size, 455 million miles. Circumference of the head, 10.5 billion miles. So this, someday I hope to find someone, if there's anybody out there, send me an email if you'd like to attempt a sketch based on these measurements. It would be really interesting to see what that would look like. The length of God's beard is there. Length of God's finger is there. The black of God's eye is there. Digging deeper into text, and a text that, again, if you're Jewish, I presume you're familiar with this text, the Shema. So, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. A traditional text that I would be familiar with, Hear, O Israel. You will often hear, you go back a little ways, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. In recent years, in the last few decades, we've gotten away from gendered English about God. So rather than say Lord, which is masculine, rather than lady, we just don't translate God. We say Adonai, although Adonai in Hebrew means my Lord. This word here, which we're reading as Adonai, I think I have more to say about this later, actually doesn't say Adonai. But because the word is so sacred in Jewish tradition, we never say it. When we come to it in prayer, we say Adonai instead of actually trying to say the name. But the interesting thing is the ambiguity of this word Echad. So these are just a few legitimate, plausible translations of the text. Adonai is now our God. Adonai will be one. Adonai our God. Adonai alone. There's no other gods. Adonai is one, namely one God, not three, not 16. Adonai our God is one indivisible Adonai, a unique Adonai, ultimate Adonai. And this one, which we're going to pick up on, Adonai is unity and everything. I love the fact that I have a book behind me, which is entirely devoted to this question of what does the word Echad mean in this prayer. And so in this book, there are 25 different essays on the word Adonai, each coming up with a different understanding of the meaning of that word. So think about it. We have an entire book on one word in the Bible. I suspect with a little imagination, we could do entire books on many, many other words in the Bible as well. This is the world of Kabbalah and of Jewish study. By the way, in this prayer, we have the word Yisrael, Shema Yisrael. So what's the word Yisrael? Yisrael enters the Hebrew Bible when Yaakov gets his name changed from the heel to Yisrael, because he wrestles Yisrael with El. El is a word for God, and he gets his name changed to God Wrestler. His name was originally Heel. How did he wind up with such a beautiful name as Heel? He was holding on to his twin brother Esau's heel when he was born. So his name gets changed to the God Wrestler. So if you're out there and you say you struggle with God, and I have people come to me in hospitals and settings of tragedy saying, you know what, I have problems with God. I don't understand how God could allow X to happen to Y, where X and Y might be cancer to my loved one. It might be, global warming to the world, you name it, and everything in between. And my question to them, you wrestle, you struggle with this idea of God? They say, yes. My response is, welcome to our club. The name of our club is Yisrael. We are the God wrestlers. By the way, we're going to be talking about this in a few weeks when we get to Islam and Judaism. Islam and Judaism are actually very close to one another, much closer theologically than either is to Christianity. We'll talk a lot about that. But the word Islam means one who submits. So there's a very different sort of taste here, a very different approach to our relationship with God. In Judaism, we wrestle with God. We struggle with God. One of the most astounding ideas in Kabbalah, and we'll keep coming back to this, is the idea that God needs us. God can't do it by God's self. This is an incredible idea. God is relying on us to do the work that's necessary to be done in the universe. This is not a flavor you get from Islam, where the focus in Islam is on a Muslim, one who submits to the will of God. Even the calligraphy of the Shema is interesting and significant. Many of you may know this. Again, this is what the Shema would look like if you open a Torah scroll. And actually, I'm hoping a week from Friday, the Torah portion is Viat Hanan, and the Shema is in that. So I'm actually hoping to take out the Torah scroll, the Temple of Elohim, and unroll it, and to this section, so you can actually see this calligraphy. So if you look at the calligraphy, you could see this letter Ayin and this letter Daled are written unusually large, and of course there's meaning in it. I've tried to do it here also. So the Ayin and the Daled being written large has at least two explanations. There's actually more. One is Ayin and Daled stand for the word Eid, which means witness, or could also mean congregation. So the name of the synagogue in Thousand Oaks, where I'm the scholar in residence, is Adat Elohim, and the Adat comes from the word Eid, this word Ayin Daled. And the other is the large Ayin makes sure that we see that this Ayin, which is a silent letter, is not an Aleph. If we hear it, we can't tell whether that it's an Ayin or an Aleph, so they write it large so we don't miss it, because Shema, which is an Aramaic word with an Aleph instead of an Ayin, would be perhaps. So then we'd be saying, perhaps Israel, O Israel, God is, Adonai is our God. And the large Daled makes sure we don't confuse it with a Resh, because then this word, instead of being Echad, one, would be Acher, which means another. So that's, again, digging into the significance of the calligraphy. The mystics are going to focus on the idea of Echad meaning unity. So Adonai Echad in the Shema means God is unity. God is the ultimate unity of the universe. Everything is God, and God is everything. The separations that we have between ourselves and God are illusions. Like I was just in Hawaii, and I actually did some boogie boarding and surfing on waves without standing up. You see these beautiful waves in Hawaii. They look like distinct characters and unique, and they are unique, but they're also part of the sea. So although we might think that a wave is separate from the sea, it of course turns out that the wave is part of the sea. In the same way, you may think that I am separate from you, that the computer is separate from you, that the window in your room is separate from you, that the book is separate from you, but in fact, they are all part of the unity. One example that's often used is the parts of the tree. We're biologists and scientists, so we give names to different parts of the tree. But the tree doesn't know where the roots end and the trunk begins, where the trunk ends and a branch begins, and so on and so on. It's one tree. I am one person, but I have fingernails, and I have fingers, and I have red blood cells and white blood cells and all different parts of my body. But even though there are lots of different parts, it's all part of a unified me. So here's an exercise, and I can only see about half of you, maybe even less than half of you. When I count to 3, I want you to point to God. I don't want you to think about it that much. 1, 2, 3, point to God. I'm looking. Lots of cowards out there. Okay, good. So I want to present to you 2 different representations of God. And they're both valid and they're both traditional Jewish. One is conventional and rational. In this concept, God is up there, and some of you were pointing up, and I'm down here. So every Jewish blessing begins with the words, Baruch Atah Adonai. When I say the word Atah, I am saying you. Blessed are you, Adonai. Once I say the word you, I have introduced a separation and a distinction. There's you, God, and there's me down here. I want to emphasize this is valid and Jewish, but it's not the mystical sense. The mystical sense can't be drawn because even your computer is part of God. In the mystical sense, everything is God. So I have a dashed line there. And here I am, but there's also a dashed line because for some purposes, I may seem like I am separate from God, but from the mystic's point of view, everything is God and everything is under the control of God and everything is working out exactly the way God intends it to work out, which I find I have all kinds of problems with. I'm going to go a little bit further, and then I'll call upon, see if there's any discussion. So you would say, well, how can everything be in control of God, but I still have free will? Because I think it's an essence of Judaism to understand that we have free will. The mystics would say everything is God, everything is under God's control, and everything is just as it should be. And as Larry Kushner, my teacher, said, this is a theology that should not be brought near to a hospital room. If you have a grieving parent whose child is horribly ill, I would find it enraging to hear my rabbi tell me, well, God's in control and this really is the will of God. Because it's saying the cancer, the accident, even the war, the Holocaust, the gas chambers, everything are under the control of God. What I'm hearing an echo of myself, so I am going to mute everyone again. So I personally have great difficulty with this. I, like every one of you, have had tragedy in my life and continuing tragedy in my life. And this is an aspect of Kabbalah I just can't bring myself to accept. If I believed it, I would be in another profession. Let me see if there's anything else I want to cover. Oh, actually, we're almost done. Okay, so let me back up. Yes, okay, so actually I'm gonna pause. I'm gonna pause the sharing and whoops. Oh, was I sharing? Hold on. Yeah, stop share, sorry. Okay, so I'm pausing the sharing. Bryce, I see you have your hand up and I'll entertain other questions and then mention the CNN special on Jerusalem that's coming up next week. Bryce, did you have your hand up? Or?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
And two quick points.
Mm-hmm.
From a modern physics point of view, the idea that the universe is all connected and everything is connected to everything else and nothing is separate is really the modern physical point of view. You know, the whole idea that there are separate things is just something that is an illusion of the how tightly connected certain things are to each other. That's all. It's an illusion. But everything is weakly connected to everything else. And the second point is, if the Kabbalist believes that everything is as it should be and is existing, just developing according to whatever plan there is, then morality has no meaning because all of right and wrong is just what happens without having anything to do with what you intend.
Yes, so that's true, except the texts say something which is very puzzling. The texts say in a couple of different places, Pirkei Avot, well, let me first talk about Bible. In the book of Deuteronomy, this is a section that we read actually on Yom Kippur. There is a plea, and this is Moses' last speech to the people before we enter the promised land, quoting God saying, I set before you this day, basically life and blessing, and curses and death. And then God says, choose life. So the understanding is that God gives us the free will ability to choose or not choose. There's another quote, which is even more puzzling, which is from the Mishnah, from Pirkei Avot, which says, everything is foreseen by God, but free will is given. And so that's also puzzling. And the only way I can make rational sense out of this, putting on my sort of physicist mathematician brain that I know, Bryce, you have on all the time, is the idea that we have free will in this life, but God knows what our free will choices will be. And God can't force us in one direction or another, but God has set this up and set it up so that we are actually God's partner in the work. One of the things I actually say at every funeral, because the funerals always end, and Jewish mourning involves with a prayer of praises for God. The mourner's Kaddish, the one that begins Yit Gadal, the Yit Gadah Shemei Rabbah. In Aramaic, by the way, not Hebrew, except for the last line, is simply a recitation, a rhythmic, almost hypnotic recitation of praises for God. So the question is, why are we praising God? And it has to do with what I would say is the essential teaching of Judaism, which I think really is Kabbalistic, which is that God could have created a perfect world. God could have created a world without death, a world without war, a world without disease, a world without hunger, a world without poverty, a world without political argumentation, a world without bad hair days. God could have created an absolutely perfect world. But if we lived in an absolutely perfect world, what would our job be? We would literally have nothing to do. So therefore, God only takes creation a certain distance, creates some stuff, and then turns over to us the work of creation. And God's role is as a teacher, but God doesn't force our hands. Presumably, if I take Kabbalah literally, God knows what we're going to do, but God doesn't force our hands. Let's see, Sylvia is asking, if everything isn't controlled by God, this seems to take away the idea that man needs to put in an effort and trying and making things happen if everything's controlled by God. Yeah, what's also controlled by God is God has given us the impulse to do things as a free will choice. And that's part of the plan. And you will see this over and over again in Kabbalah, that God needs humanity. God cannot do the job without humanity. There's a wonderfully deep book by Abraham Joshua Heschel, which summarizes the essence of this. The name of the book is God in Search of Man. Probably the most poignant and amazing thing about God from this perspective is that God needs us. God is not independent and completely in control. And as I think about it, I'd be interested in your reaction to this. As I think about it, I would find it hard to serve and love a leader which is completely omnipotent, which has the power to do anything, that has control, intimate control over every aspect of my life, and everything is under God's control. And I'm just a chess piece. That doesn't make me feel like I'm created B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. But I can relate, and I would say Kabbalah, in its essence, is in relating to God as someone who needs me, who commands me to love God, which is a very bizarre command, and needs my action to make this world a better place. That's a club I can get involved in. Mm-hmm. So anybody else have a comment or a thought?
Well, I just wanted to end with what I was talking about earlier, and that is that if God already knows what we are all going to do, then the whole idea that I'm making a choice that is completely foreseen, it just doesn't make any logical sense. That's all I can. That's
Yeah, I would agree with you. That's a logical puzzle, and you and I have discussed this before. And it's here's a to dig deeper into that particular puzzle. You're watching a movie that you've seen a dozen times, and the sweet innocent guy and his girlfriend are going toward the door where behind the middle door is some lunatic in a hockey mask and a chainsaw. And you're begging this person, don't open that door, don't open that door. But in fact, whether or not that person opened the door was determined once the movie was shot. There's the character we know has no free will, but inside the movie, the character does have free will. So that's about the best way I can explain it, is we actually do have free will. I don't doubt that for a moment, but God knows in advance, because God sees through time, what our free will choices will be.
But the images on screen don't have souls.
Well, people cry and people get deeply involved with these images. So I understand the problem, and I don't have any better way of explaining it than that. Cheryl is asking, I have issues with why God has emotions in the Torah. God gets angry. Yeah, God's only human. The images in the Torah. So actually, here's a point where I thought I might stop and ask you to comment. If the Torah tells us that God created humanity in God's image, what does that tell you about God? And what does that tell you about humanity? I'm curious if anybody wants to.
That God may be imperfect like humanity is?
Yeah, that's a possibility.
I don't believe that.
You don't have to believe that.
Okay.
But you have to admit that is a possibility.
It is. It's
Yeah.
logically a possibility.
Right.
Theoretically.
Remember, Judaism isn't about what you believe or don't believe.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, Rachel.
Oh, I've been learning.
Oh God.
Just
Yay, I know
loving
that book.
it.
I know that
I'm
book.
loving it.
Do you have
love
one of
it.
the rare copies that are not signed?
Yes,
Oh,
I do.
congratulations.
I actually purchased it from Amazon.
Yeah, they're
Thank
very
you
hard
very
to
much.
find. This is a copy of a book I wrote called A Christian's Guide to Judaism.
And
Yeah.
he did a phenomenal job, and I'm enjoying it very much. Very, very much.
Thank you. Rachel.
Welcome.
If we're created in God's image and we get angry, then that must be a quality of God that we have got.
Yeah.
And the first place that I really noticed that was a discussion with you one time with a group was when God decides to create Eve. He says, because man is lonely. Man shouldn't be alone. So God had to have some understanding of this human emotion of loneliness. So, yeah, I think.
Okay, that is something
Yeah.
I talk about a lot. In the opening chapter of the Bible, God makes this, God makes that. Some things are good, some things are very good, nothing's perfect. And then the first thing that's mentioned in the Bible as not being good is loneliness. God says it is not good for the human, the Adam, to dwell alone and
I agree.
needs a companion. So, one of the questions is, I can't remember if I get into this in a later discussion, why did God create the universe? Okay, so there's a pretty fundamental question. Why? Anybody want to respond to that? Why?
To learn, maybe? To
learn
learn
from
through
who?
us?
To-
Through us, his
Oh, that-
creation.
Yeah, I like it. Any other thoughts on why did God create the universe?
He's
Presumably.
lonely and bored.
Okay, that's
Bored.
that's a answer that I really like.
Yeah.
And you can
sure.
state it in a lot of ways, that God values relationship. God
Yeah.
is inherently a relational God.
Mhm.
That God likes stories. I've heard it described that way, which is another way I kind of like. God is lonely. There's a traditional Jewish answer, and also an answer I hear from a lot of Christians, which is if God is to be praised, then you have to have people around to praise God. That's an answer that makes God a little bit of an egoist, which I'm not crazy about, but it's an answer I hear a lot. Jane.
Could it, oh, I'm sorry.
If everything is, I mean, God, we're made in God's image, and yet all of our answers are, well, he's lonely, he's this, that's all in human image. So so that's the exact opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that what I'm pointing to is the text says God made humanity in God's image.
Right. And yet
So-
we're giving human things of, so that he wasn't alone,
Right.
so that he could, that's human.
Right. So what I would say is if God makes people in God's image, then we are made in God's image. Therefore, by looking at our image, that should tell us something about God, and that's what people have been focusing on. And the flip side of that, which people might care to discuss, is what does it tell us about humans? What aspect of humanity resembles God? So I'll
Our
just call it
souls.
our souls,
Right.
okay, and that,
Yeah.
and we'll hear that. Carrie.
I think another aspect
Yes.
of God is throughout the Bible, there's stories that, God would get angry
Right.
and God would show his anger. And that's very much a human characteristic.
Right, and
And
God is jealous. One of the Ten
Yes.
Commandments is
And I like that, it creates that sort of the relationship that there is some component of God that is with man and some components of man that are part of God. And that anger and that jealousy and that envy are part of us. And I do think that exemplifies God.
I often think that studying sacred text is Rorschach.
Is
And
what?
that Rorschach, does everybody know what a Rorschach test is? The ink blot? A
Right.
psychiatrist shows you the ink blot and you tell them what
Yes.
you think. Or you look at a cloud and so studying sacred text often tells you as much about the person you're studying with than as it tells you about the text. So one very interesting question is, do you like that God gets jealous? Do you like that God needs us or not? That's a matter of personal taste. Carrie, you've had your hand up for a long time.
Okay. Yeah. So I thought possibly also the reason why God may have created us and created this world and this existence is that it actually gives God some type of purpose. I mean, we're not told if God was doing something beforehand. I mean, we're not even supposed to ask about that. But if we are not created without purpose, then I would assume that God also has to have a purpose. And I think that, I mean, with us being co-creators with Hashem, it just makes sense that maybe he did this to give his own self a purpose.
Yeah. So what do you think the purpose of God is?
Well, I mean, I think he gives us direction. I mean, that's why we have Torah. He gave us the instructions of how we are to live and how we are to treat other people. I mean, and if we were to all keep those perfectly, I mean, everything would be perfect, right? I mean, this would be a perfect world. We would finally accomplish the goal.
So is that the overall goal, to make the world better and better and better and maybe even perfect?
Well, I think it's to take, well, but I think we also have to learn in the process. We have to have the opportunity to make mistakes because it gives us meaning and reason behind why we make this choice and not the other choice. It's about taking the information that we put in our head and then connecting it with our heart and giving it a deeper meaning of, we do this because, not just we do this because we're told, but we do this because of all these other experiences we've had to have that reason to do it.
Right. And I think you're dancing around the essence of this. God could have just instantly created a perfect world, but then we would have nothing to do. We would be decorations in God's garden. So instead, God creates a world, but only takes creation so far and turns over to us the job of continuing creation, which means we have cosmic significance. One of the things I really like about this idea is if I give to tzedakah, if I help someone, it's not only me, Mike, doing a nice thing for this person. A traditional perspective, a Kabbalistic perspective, is I am putting one puzzle piece in the perfection, the repair, and the perfection of the world, tikkun olam. And we're going to say a lot more about that because that's really the essence of Lurrianic Kabbalah. Tune in next week. Richard.
Yes, I want to focus on the idea of image as opposed to, it doesn't say that we were created to be identical to God. It says we are created
Right.
in God's image. And I think what that might mean is that we have the potential to sort of behave in godlike or good ways. So that's it. You know,
okay.
the idea of
Yeah,
image
you're right.
doesn't
It doesn't.
mean
It
identical.
doesn't.
We're not. God didn't create us to be gods. He created
Right.
us to have the potential to do
Right.
good.
Right. And one of the things we're going to see next week is the Sefirot is an understanding of the physical nature of God, or the spiritual, I'd say, not physical nature, correct that. The spiritual nature of God, the fact that in some sense God resembles us, that gives us some keys to understanding the spiritual nature of God. Ken and Patricia.
This is an uneducated speculation, but I'm wondering, we have some indication that there were angels and that there was, for lack of a better word, a heavenly court. Might it be the case that God did create a perfect something, and that the angels, in fact, didn't have free will, but only did God's bidding, and he sort of that wasn't very satisfying to him to just have these people running around doing whatever he said. And so he said, oh, let's try this now, and then created the universe.
Yes, your speculation is anything but uneducated. There are wonderful midrashes which actually record the conversation. God is talking to the angels, and God says, so I'm thinking about creating humanity. What do you guys think? And they start quoting all the ways that humanity will screw up in the Torah. They're going to do this, they're going to do that, they're going to do that. Don't create humanity. And God gets into an argument with the angels and decides to create us nonetheless. And by the way, that argument, which is in Jewish Midrash, is also in the Quran, the Muslim holy book. So it is certainly not ignorant speculation.
Wow.
Jane on the East Coast struggling to stay
No.
awake. I don't blame you. Yes. I don't know if your hand just up from before?
From before. Sorry about that.
No problem. And I'll call on Bryce, but I'm also encouraging other folks that want to participate.
Sure, but I just wanted to say one thing, that when you try to think about all of the aspects of reality, all of, every one of them makes a greater number of potential combinations that God would have to be able to understand and anticipate if God were to be of infinite knowledge and infinite intelligence. And an infinite being would not be able to think because it would take an infinite amount of time to make a thought. So God,
unless
hang on,
unless God
let me
is
just finish.
infinitely fast.
Let me finish. Well, yeah, but yeah, you can't be infinitely fast. So anyway, the whole point of creating humanity is as an experiment to actually see how things do work out, because God can't actually know everything. It's an impossible task, because the more he knows, the more there is to know. And it's an infinite recursion.
Yeah, so I would say, other than the logic, which I think is reasonable, the text is pretty clear that God is not omniscient. And the text that I always point to, knowing everything is omniscience. The text that I always point to is Genesis 6:6, where it's right before the flood. And I know Bruce is asking about a flood, and Cheryl's asking about a flood. Everybody's asking about a perfect world. Genesis 6:6, just before the flood, people are screwing up royally, and apparently even the animals are screwing up. So God decides to destroy everything. But the text says And God regretted having made humankind, and it saddened God's heart to see, it pained God's heart actually, to see how humanity had turned out. So right there in Genesis 6:6, there's a clear indication that God is not omniscient. The idea of God being omniscient and all-knowing enters Judaism, as I mentioned before, about 1,000 years ago with the philosophers and Maimonides, and it enters Judaism under the influence of Islam, and from the Muslim perspective, God is certainly all-powerful and all-knowing, and the Jewish philosophers, I think, just buy into this idea, but I think that's an impossible concept to defend biblically.
Maybe God was just washing out the petri dish with flood.
The divine petri dish. So Shell's asking, why does God have to wipe out most people other than Noah and his family? The simple meaning in the text is everybody is screwing up. The question I always ask Cheryl is, why did God wipe out the bunny rabbits? What did the bunny rabbits do that was wrong? By the way, how did the goldfish survive? And believe it or not, there's an answer. This is not going to make you happy. And let me put it this way. It didn't make me happy, but the rabbis of the Midrash say animals were mating with other animals not of their kind. There was inter-species breeding against the will of God, and that's why the animals had to be wiped out. The answer for me is I don't take those texts literally. And so, I study them in a scholarly sense. But if I'm a Kabbalist, I have to take them literally and I have to deal with it. And the issue is the same in Sodom and Gomorrah. The interesting issue with Sodom and Gomorrah is, of course, that Abraham enters into an argument with God and says, if we can find a few just people, will you save the whole town for the sake of, I think Abraham starts with 50, 40, 30, 20, and gets down to 10, which is one of the reasons for a minyan in prayer. And apparently, God is willing to save entire towns if there are a few righteous people living in the town, but there aren't. So the town has to be destroyed. And by the way, the sin, as the rabbis understand Sodom and Gomorrah, and Ezekiel, I think, or Elijah, I can't understand, is inhospitality. It's that strangers were treated brutally in Sodom and Gomorrah. Bruce is asking, didn't God create a perfect world in Eden and then cast us out? So I have a talk, I don't even know if it's on my website, but maybe I'll do it, called Revisiting the Garden of Eden with a Jewish Tour Guide. So didn't God know he was going to do that? So I think to summarize a pretty complicated discussion, Eden was a setup. I've talked a bit about free will. You can't have free will in theory. You have to have free will in practice. So God sets up perfection and says, oh, by the way, you see these beautiful fruit? It doesn't say it's an apple. The reason the fruit became an apple has to do with a Latin pun in the 4th century from St. Jerome. God says, look at this beautiful tree. Don't eat it. Everything else is fine. It's like telling your kids you're about to go off for an evening. Trust the kids, there's microwave popcorn, there's pizza, there's your favorite show. Don't look in mom's upper left-hand drawer.
And they're going.
Saying that, they're going to do it. So I believe the whole thing is a setup. I believe this Garden of Eden is a parable about humans attaining either humanity or children becoming adult, but it's a more complicated story. And Christianity and Islam starts to talk about Satan and fallen angels and disobedient angels and so on. That idea actually enters more in Greek thought than in the original Hebrew thought. What happens in Eden is never referred to as a sin. So it's original sin doesn't exist in Judaism. In fact, as some of you know, if you're really into your liturgy, one of the prayers that we say in every morning service is Elohai neshama shenatata bi tahorahi. Oh God, the soul you have given me is pure. And some of the scholars believe that prayer entered Jewish liturgy as a sort of subtle refutation of the idea that of original sin. Should he have wiped out the people in Pinchas? A lot of them were wiped out. I don't know what you're referring to specifically, Cheryl.
Well, I mean, he wipes out all of Sodom and Gomorrah, and here it is, you have Pinchas, who becomes a holy priest, and yet he takes a spear and spears people.
And it's really problematic because Pinchas is never criticized, although in the Vav of Shalom, in Pinchas' covenant of peace that God promises to Pinchas, the Vav is slightly smaller in scribal tradition. So that's what the rabbis sort of hang their hat on. But there are many stories in the Bible that are very troubling, and I'm not going to try and resolve that this evening. I have thoughts on that, and I'm pretty sure you've actually heard me spew them, but I'm not going to try and do that tonight. Any other thoughts? It's just about 8:30 Pacific time. Anybody have any other closing thoughts? I want to pop on the screen this slide. What I really want to show you is this slide. Some of you may be aware of this. On Sunday, CNN is going to have a series. I actually don't even know how many. I think there's 5 episodes, but I'm not sure. About Jerusalem. I am obsessed with Jerusalem. In fact, the discussion of children of Abraham, when I've given this discussion in the past, has had 3 sessions. I've added a 4th session just so I can talk about Jerusalem for an entire session. So I certainly won't assume that you've seen the series, but I'm very much looking forward to it. And a wonderful world of television these days is that it's easy to record things. And
Rabbi?
hopefully you can do that. Yes.
Excuse me, according to IMDb, it starts on July 18th and there's 6 episodes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this Sunday.
It starts this Sunday, so there's.
Yeah.
Oh,
and
I
did
8/4. It's definitely not 8. Oh, the Children of Abraham series is starting 8/4, not the.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's. Not
yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And that Messiah, when I was watching the videos on YouTube, because I wasn't there live, and you were talking about on Netflix that show Messiah, the first season. Well, I went and I watched the first one and then I just binge watched it. I could not stop watching it. This whole what if.
Yes.
It's absolutely one of the most phenomenal conceptual ideas I think that so far in my lifetime they've come up with, and I can't wait to see where they take it. What directions and corners are going to go. And I love the fact that it includes all the major religions that people would be able to identify in the world today. All the major ones. It's actually incredible. Absolutely incredible. I am beyond fascinated with it.
Okay.
Well, I can't wait till December 29th, 2021.
Okay. So so it basically then what it's an example of is, Christians believe in a second coming of the Messiah. Islam holds with the idea of a coming of the Messiah. Judaism certainly holds with the idea of a coming of Messiah. So what they're doing in a way is Midrash, is saying, well, what if the Messiah came? How would that look in the world? And of course, this is one writer's perspective, but it's clear it was written from a pretty knowledgeable base.
Extremely intellectual, intelligent sort. Yes, and that's what I love about it.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. So I will close by thanking you for coming. Some of you late at night, and look forward to seeing you again next week. Sometime probably before the end of the night, I will post the video of tonight's session. And stay well, stay healthy, and next week, Lurrianic Kabbalah and the Zohar.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.